Hello, everybody. This is David Price, and thank you for joining me again today for part 2 of our Cathar series, The LightWeavers of Languedoc. We're just going to go ahead and pick up where we left off on the last video. So let me go ahead and get the screen share going here for us on our Google Hangout. Okay. Looks like we have it all set up and ready to go. Okay. Chapter 3, Where Good and Evil Meet. This is a Cathar prayer. These are they who fell from paradise when Lucifer lured them thence, with the lying assurance that whereas God allowed them the good only, the devil, being false to the core, would let them enjoy both good and evil. And he promised to give them wives whom they would love dearly, and that they should have authority over one another, and that some amongst them should be kings, or emperors, or counts, and that they would learn to hunt birds with birds and beasts with beasts. Up until now, we have been able to treat the problem of the Cathars as if their heresy existed in isolation. Of course, this was not the case. They posed a massive threat to the Church of Rome on the basis of their success in nearby Occitania and northern Italy. But they were, in fact, of a much larger heresy that threatened the entire Christian establishment in Europe. Not only the Roman Catholics in the West, but also the Orthodox Church of the East, based in Constantinople. That's ancient Byzantium, known today as Istanbul. The Catholic Orthodox schism had been developing for centuries and had become official in AD 1054. By that date, the former bishops of Constantinople had already long been in the habit of calling themselves ecumenical patriarchs. Literally, patriarchs of the entire inhabited world. Since this seemed to challenge the Pope's own claim to the top job, it was a source of great mutual hostility. Nevertheless, both churches were of one mind on the subject of heresy, which was to be stamped out. And just as Rome faced the heresy of Catharism in the West in the 12th and 13th centuries, so too, and for rather longer, the Patriarchate in Constantinople confronted the heresy known as Bogomilism in the East, which began its period of expansion some 200 years earlier and survived until the end of the 14th century. It was called Bogomilism after its supposed founder, whose name in Greek was Theophilus, and in Slav, Bogomil, meaning beloved of God. Active in Bulgaria in the first half of the 10th century, this enigmatic individual preached a form of dualism that was identical in almost every detail to the creed that would later be introduced into Western Europe as Catharism. Hand in hand with these spiritual teachings, he is also remembered as the organizer of a political rebellion that gave the persecuted Slav peoples a voice and incited them to withdraw their labor and fealty from their Grecianized Bulgar overlords. Although the Bogomil heresy endured in the East for 3 centuries longer than Western Catharism, there is little reliable information about Bogomil himself. Not a single contemporary reference to him has come down to us, and we know nothing about where or when he was born or died, who his teachers were, or how widely he preached. The earliest surviving report to mention him by name, although it is not the earliest to notice the heresy he started, appears in a book written at some point between AD 977 and AD 990. The work of a hostile Christian monk named Cosmas. This tract tells us only that, quote, in the days of the Orthodox Tsar Peter, AD 927 through 969, there lived a priest called Bogomil, loved of God, who in reality was not loved of God, Bogomil, who was the first to sow heresy in the land of Bulgaria. Though it supplies no more information about the man himself, Cosma's book was written specifically to denounce the faith that Bogomil had founded. His purpose was to draw the attention of the Orthodox Church to the threat it faced and to upbraid church authorities for the lapses that had permitted such a heresy to flourish. Close to the sources of power. In the years following the death of Tsar Peter in AD 969, Bogomilism spread rapidly westwards out of Bulgaria into the Balkan principalities of Serbia and Bosnia, where it fared so well that it was frequently the official state religion. Equally influential in Croatia, Dalmatia, and Macedonia, it also extended its grip into the heart of the great city of Constantinople itself, headquarters of the Orthodox Church of the East. The first account of Bogomilism being practiced within the walls of Constantinople dates from 1045. It is found in a letter written by the monk Euthemius of Parablepton, who even claimed to have discovered a heretical cell in his own monastery. Cosmas I, from 1075 to 1081, was the first emperor of Constantinople to take stern action against the Bogomils. His successor, Alexius I Comnenus, 1081 to 1118, was even more vehement in his attacks on the heresy. At an uncertain date between 1097 and 1104, he ordered the arrest of a known Bogomil named Diblatus, who was tortured for information about key figures in the movement. The trail led to Basil, a renegade monk from Macedonia, now living undercover at a monastery in Constantinople, who was said to have been a Bogomil evangelist for more than 40 years. Next, Comnenus set a trap for Basil, pretending only to know of him as a respected Orthodox monk. The emperor innocently asked for enlightenment about the Christian faith. Human nature being what it is, Basil could not pass up this apparently golden opportunity and set out to try to convert Comnenus to Bogomilism. A series of meetings followed in which the emperor thoroughly debriefed the unfortunate Basil, getting him to reveal not only the central doctrines of the heresy, but also compromising details of its organization and membership in Constantinople. Basil and his associates were then arrested, and contemporary accounts tell us that Comnenus reasoned in person with the Bogomils, trying to win them back to the Orthodox faith. Those who recanted were pardoned and released. Those who would not recant were imprisoned for life. Only Basil on this occasion suffered the extreme penalty, so much favored by heresy hunters in the West, of being burnt to death. His stake was set up in Constantinople's hippodrome for the edification of a large crowd. Surviving records from Constantinople say nothing more about Bogomilism until the 1140s, when there are reports of more heresy trials. Then, in 1145, we learn that no less than a figure than Cosmas Atticus, patriarch of the Orthodox Church, has fallen under the spell of a certain Niphon, a Bogomil, when, horror of horrors, the heretic was allowed to take up residence in the patriarchal palace. Other ecclesiastics began to agitate against him. Eventually, they took their complaints directly to Emperor Manuel I, himself later rumored to have had converted to Bogomil tendencies, or had covert Bogomil tendencies. And in 1147, Cosmas was deposed and Niphon arrested. Still, the episode indicates that by the mid-12th century, at about the time that Catharism was first detected in the West, Bogomilism had grown from a minor cult started by an unknown priest into a major religion that could position itself close to the sources of power in the East. This sense of a big faith on the move, taking shape, growing in confidence, and building up structure before our eyes is heightened 20 years later in 1167. In that year, seemingly out of the blue, Nicetas, a senior Bogomil bishop from Constantinople, suddenly turned up in the West. He arrived first in Lombardy in northern Italy, where he persuaded the local Cathar bishops to adopt important doctrinal changes and to be reconsoled at his hands. Then he moved on to the Languedoc. The entire Cathar administration of Occitania had gathered to await his presence at the small town of Saint-Félix-de-Caraman, near Toulouse. Under his guidance, routine matters such as boundary disputes among the existing Cathar bishoprics were resolved, and 3 new dioceses of Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Agen were established. As in Lombardy, however, the primary purpose of Nicetas' visit seems to have been to urge important doctrinal changes upon the Cathars and to reaffirm what were clearly, by this stage, well-established links between the Cathar and Bogomil churches. Indeed, the immense respect shown to Nicetas and the fact that he once again reconsoled all the perfecti present tell us very clearly that the relationship between these two churches was that of a senior to a junior, or a father to a son. The Cathars of 1167, in other words, clearly regarded Bogomilism as the home church to which they owed their allegiance. This conclusion is endorsed by modern historians who have amassed persuasive evidence that the Catharism of the West was indeed a direct offshoot of Bogomilism. Although northern Italy is closer to Constantinople, the heresy seems to have been brought to northern France and even to Germany first. A report has survived of the trial of a Cathar bishop in Cologne as early as 1143. When it reached the Languedoc, and by what route is not certain, but it had clearly been present long enough by 1167 for bishoprics to have been established and boundary disputes to have broken out. It seems, however, that there must also have been some doctrinal lapse among the Western Cathars, which the doctrinal changes introduced by Papa Nicetas were designed to correct. These brought Catharism into line with its own powerful faction of the Bogomil Church, which believed in the absolute opposition of the two powers of good and evil. By contrast, there were other Bogomils, and prior to 1167, many Cathars too, whose beliefs compromised this pristine polarity. These so-called mitigated dualists contemplated linkages and even family relationships between the good God and the God of evil, something that absolute dualists were not prepared to do. Another objective of Nicetas' visit was to organize further missionary activity throughout Europe using Occitania as a bridgehead. There is evidence that delegates left the 1167 Council of St. Philly invigorated and actively anticipating the prospect. Social engineering. In the decades after Nicetas, at the close of the 12th century, the Cathar and Bogomil churches began to look increasingly as though they are involved in a well-planned and coordinated plot. The purpose of this plot could not have been more revolutionary: to compete with and eventually to overthrow the Church of Rome and the Orthodox Church of the East. The absurd worship of the evil God who had made this world was to be undermined, not all at once, but slowly, city by city, region by region. The true dualist religion of the Cathars and the Bogomils was to be introduced in its place. The fundamental aim of the project was to free the souls of all mankind from the prison of matter and allow them to return to the heavenly realm of the good God who had made them. Since this would require an attitude towards material things radically different from the dominant interests of the times, it was obvious that permanent changes in the structure of society would also be necessary. For us as researchers, this issue was clarified when we discovered that the Cathars in Occitania had involved themselves quite extensively in what we described in the last chapter as meddling with the feudal economic order. It seemed unlikely to be a coincidence when we learned that the Bogomils did exactly the same thing. From the earliest references in the 10th century, they are linked with social, economic, and political upsets. Quote, "They teach their followers not to obey their masters," warned the monk Cosmas in his expose of the abominations of this seemingly new heresy. "They scorn the rich, they hate the czars, they ridicule their superiors, they reproach the boyars, they believe that God looks in horror on those who labor for the Tsar and advise every serf not to work for his master," unquote. Confronted by material like this, it is little wonder that many historians have judged Bogomilism to be, at base, a social movement directed against feudal oppression. Others disagree and argue that we should beware of attributing too much importance to the social anarchism of the Bogomils, or of seeing in them Slavonic communists of the Middle Ages. In our opinion, neither view is quite correct. The Bogomils were not early communists or any such thing, since communism is a wholly materialistic ethic concerned only with the material world. Neither were they at base a social movement. Exactly like Catharism, the evidence convinces us that the Bogomil religion was first and last a spiritual movement, interested exclusively in the liberation of souls. It was the efficient pursuit of this spiritual objective rather than any of the normal characteristics of a social movement that led the Bogomils inevitably towards revolutionary behavior in the material world. It inspired a critical attitude towards earthly hierarchies and put a new mood of intelligent rebelliousness into the air. The same phenomenon of social engineering running alongside dualist heresy was observed in other parts of Europe as well. In Occitania and France, we showed in the last chapter how the Cathars busied themselves in the education of a skilled artisan class, notably weavers and others involved in the cloth and paper trades. In this way, empowerment of the poor through skills training went hand in hand with the spread of faith. We were therefore not surprised to learn that researchers in Italy have unearthed proof of significant links there between Catharism and the trade of purse making. Like weaving, this was an occupation that could provide suitable cover for missionary activities, enabling Cathar evangelists to travel incognito, making and selling their wares, and at the same time making heretical contacts. So although the dualists profess to hate this world, such strategies show that they did not hesitate to use rather worldly and streetwise methods to win converts from the established Christian churches. After traveling amongst the Italian Cathars in the early 13th century, Ivo of Narbonne reported that they routinely, quote, sent to Paris capable students from nearly all Lombard and some Tuscan cities. There, some studied logic, others theology, with the aim of strengthening their own error and overthrowing the Catholic faith. Such evidence of calculation and strategy seems less discordant with the Cathars' ethereal central purpose when we remember that they believe themselves to be locked in an elemental struggle, often literally to death, for the soul of man. If the Catholic Church were allowed to crush out the light of Catharism forever, then the soul of man would likewise be lost forever. With the stakes so high and the enemy so diabolical, any means, fair or foul, were reasonable to bring him down. School of heresy. Further evidence that Cathars and Bogomils were involved not only in social agitation, but in a coordinated plot to overthrow established Christianity comes from study of the methods they used to win conversions. The field missionaries of both sects appear to have followed the same procedures in the same order so closely that it is obvious they must have shared the same training. In this, once again, we have the sense of confronting people who were not in any way ethereal, but on the contrary, rather down to earth, calculating and strategic. They also demonstrated a good basic knowledge of psychology in ensuring that the course of instruction they gave as missionaries began with easily acceptable generalities and moved on only very slowly to reveal the more deeply heretical and thus conventionally shocking aspects of their faith. Euthemius Zigabenus, who interrogated the monk Basil in Constantinople while he was awaiting his execution in the Hippodrome, was told that the Bogomils began by instructing their followers in those beliefs and practices which they shared with the Orthodox, quote, preserving the fouler doctrines for later and entrusting them to the more initiated in impiety as mysteries. The objective, in other words, was to detach potential converts as far as possible from the beliefs they had been raised in before attempting to substitute the alternative dualist system. Another technique used by both Bogomil and Cathar preachers was to capitalize on the common sense skepticism of ordinary people to demystify elaborate church rituals, and therefore, by association, the whole religious edifice that lay behind them. The Mass was a favorite target of the Cathars, who asked churchgoers to think very carefully and objectively about each of its details. When they partook of the wafer and the wine of Holy Communion, for instance, how could they possibly imagine, as Catholic priests had taught them, that they were consuming the actual body and blood of Christ? Wasn't this contrary to reason, if not just plain stupid? All the Catholics that had ever existed had been performing the Mass and guzzling the Holy Communion for hundreds and hundreds of years. If what they had been consuming were really the physical body and blood of Christ, then he must have been absolutely enormous, at least the size of a mountain, with veins like rivers, which clearly had not been the case. Moreover, coming at the problem from a different direction, Cathar evangelists would frequently add an unpleasant reminder about digestive processes and their end products. Did decent people who love God really want to pass his body and blood through their intestines? What kind of religion was it that would require them to participate in such bizarre and, frankly, cannibalistic practices? So logic, reason, and good taste were all against the church being right about this basic issue long before the time came to introduce more touchy Cathar doctrines like the non-physical nature of Christ. The next step in the conversion process was often for the missionary to provide concrete examples of how far the church had strayed from the true path. Favored object lessons were the notorious sins of the clergy and their extravagant lifestyles. These were then graphically compared to the simple, decent, unostentatious lives advocated in the New Testament for Christians. After contemplating the glaring contradictions thus revealed, most right-thinking citizens in the audience would have needed little further convincing that there was something rotten in the heart of the church. In a similar way, further still down the road of conversion, the method for introducing the dualist doctrine of the evil nature of material creation was to create it with numerous practical examples that anyone could easily grasp. Earthquakes might be cited, or volcanic eruptions, or lightning strikes, or snakes, along with many of the other noxious evils that we all know do stalk the material world. As before, New Testament texts would be extensively quoted, this time to show that the true teachings of Christ and his apostles endorsed the dualist rejection of material things. Malcolm Lambert, a modern scholar with decidedly pro-Catholic sympathies, claims that the heretics usually achieve these effects by dishonest manipulation of the relevant passages which were, quote, wrenched out of context, unquote, to reinforce the dualist message. The end result, most efficacious in winning conversions, was that the typical unsophisticated audience for a dualist sermon would be convinced that they had received an exhortation by good men based on the words of the founder of Christianity and of his followers. It is little wonder, therefore, that for a long while, the Cathars and the Bogomils enjoyed enormous success in their respective spheres of influence. By the end of the 12th century, they had together created what Sir Stephen Runciman describes as, quote, one great Confederate dualist church stretching from the Black Sea to Biscay. At its core were 16 bishoprics positioned in areas of influence and high population all the way to Constantinople in the east to Toulouse in the west. Since the heretics had from the beginning commanded great influence in the countryside as well as in the cities, and had generally worked from the bottom of society up in their program of conversions, they entered the 13th century occupying an astonishingly strong position in Europe. Not even 250 years had passed since Bogomil himself had first appeared in Bulgaria to preach the doctrine of the good and the evil God. Yet in that short time, an international infrastructure had been laid down and enough popular support won for medieval dualism to begin to think of itself as an established religion and to proclaim its own, quote, universality and supranational unity over and against that of the established church. The portrait of Dorian Gray. Accepting, as all scholars do, that Bogomilism and simply Bulgarian Catharism, rather was simply Bulgarian Catharism, or more accurately, that Catharism was in origin a Western form of Bogomilism. what were the most important beliefs at the core of this heretical pan-European religion. We've seen that a belief in duality was fundamental. That is to say, a belief in two gods, one good, one evil, with the latter depicted as the creator of the earth, of mankind, and of all material things. This in turn led the dualists to the conclusion that Christ, as an emanation of the good God, could not have existed, quote, in the flesh, unquote, which was by definition evil. Likewise, he could neither have been born nor crucified, both of which call for a physical body, and therefore could not have redeemed our sins by dying on the cross. The reader is also familiar with the notion, again shared in full by the Bogomils and the Cathars, that the Holy Spirit had been brought to earth by the non-physical Christ and transmitted ever since, from good man to good man, through the ritual of the consolamentum and the laying on of hands. In both branches of the religion, the ritual was the same, and in both it served as an instrument of initiation at which a sacred gnosis was acquired that raised the candidate from the class of the neophytes to the class of adepts. Such beliefs and behavior on their own clearly delineate key differences between mainstream Christianity on the one hand and the Bogomil Cathar religion on the other. But there are many more, as might be expected given the genuinely Gnostic and essentially non-authoritarian character of the heresy. Like all earlier forms and expressions of Gnosticism, it honored the power of individual revelation over and above established doctrine. The result, part of the life of the religion, was a luxuriant jungle of speculation by both Cathars and Bogomils around their key concerns. These were the origins of evil, the essential goodness and immortality of souls, and the cause of their repeated incarnations in human bodies here on wicked planet Earth. It was the encouragement given to such individual creativity and freedom of expression that led to the principal schism in the heretical church, that between so-called absolute and moderate dualists, which in turn proliferated into numerous smaller subdivisions. These seem to have competed for conversions, although they may have differing and contrary opinions. But they also apparently recognized one another and coexisted in a spirit of mutual tolerance. Despite the state of intellectual anarchy that prevailed amongst the heretics, we thought it was possible to make out certain fundamentals of their religion on which all or most seemed to have agreed. When we compared these with the fundamentals of established Christianity, it was difficult to avoid the eerie feeling that each was a weirdly distorted reflection of the other. Like Dorian Gray and his portrait in the attic, they were the same but opposites, near but very far apart. The journey of the soul. One matter of great common interest and wildly dissimilar treatment was the origin and ultimate fate of the soul and its relationship to the human body. Established Christian teaching is extremely clear. Each individual soul is a new creation of God, infused into the body destined for it. At death, the soul is separated from the body, though not permanently, as the two will be reunited at the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the dead. Then, departed souls will be restored to a bodily life, and the saved will enter in this renewed form upon the life of heaven. Said to be a fundamental element of Christian doctrine, it was a dominant view amongst medieval theologians that the resurrection will involve a collection and revivifying of the particles of the dead body. Naturally, the Cathars and Bogomils did not believe in the resurrection of the body. They regarded it as a truly impractical and actually rather hideous idea. Their interest was exclusively in the soul, which they saw as an immortal, non-physical intelligence that entered the human body at conception and thereafter wore it like a tunic until the body died. They pictured the soul as a time traveler on an immense journey towards perfection. Rather than the one-off resurrection of billions of moldering corpses on Judgment Day, their view was that each soul would be reborn many times on earth in many different bodies, both human and animal, before attaining its goal. very much as in Buddhism. The objective was to progress to the advanced state of detachment, purity, and self-control, obtainable only in human form, that was believed necessary to release the soul forever from its imprisonment in the world of matter. The price was a life, perhaps many lifetimes, of severe asceticism and meditation. Moreover, though austerities were regarded as absolutely necessary, the reader will recall that they were not on their own held to be sufficient to obtain the soul's release. For that was also required the power of the Holy Spirit transmitted through the laying on of hands in the consolamentum. So, in the dualist scheme of things, the destiny of the soul after death depended on what it had done with its period of physical incarnation just completed. If, through efforts made in this and previous lives, it had been born in the body of a man or a woman who would become a Cathar or Bogomil perfectus, and if the perfectus concerned died in a fully consoled state without having lapsed, then the soul's term of imprisonment on earth would end. Released from the snares of matter, it could rise back at last to its true home in the furthest and highest heaven, the realm of pure spirit ruled by the God of good. If, on the other hand, the soul had incarnated in a body that did not have the opportunity to encounter Cathar or Bogomil teachings, and thus to be consoled, then it would be born again in yet another body, and another, until it did finally come to the understanding of God. A doctrine of karma is not explicitly spelled out in the fragments of the dualist teachings that have come down to us. Still, it is clear that goodness and personal austerity were thought to be beneficial to the progress of the soul, while a lifetime of wickedness and self-indulgence would have profoundly negative consequences. Punishments of a karmic nature could take the form of rebirth in particularly ghastly circumstances, or as an idiot, or even as a dumb animal, which, since it could not speak or reason, would only further frustrate the progress of the soul caged within it. Jehovah, also known as the devil in the Old Testament. For Cathars and Bogomils, the earth and all material things in the perceptible universe were the work of an evil god. And while they worshiped the God of good, they acknowledged that he existed in an entirely separate dimension and had no direct influence in the devil's playground. By way of stark contrast, Christians believe in only one God, depicted as an omnipotent and universally good, who created the material world and with it the human body and soul. He also established a spiritual heaven somewhere above and outside the material dimension. There, the souls of his elect, restored to their bodies, are to be sent on the day of judgment, while for the remainder of mankind, sinners all, it is well known that God has prepared a suitable hell. For mainstream Christians, the books of the Old Testament, just like those in the New Testament, are regarded as inspired texts that form an integral part of their canonical scriptures. Much is made of the continuity between the old law shared with the synagogue and the new law brought by Jesus. Likewise, when Roman Catholics or Orthodox Christians speak of God as the Father and Jesus as the Son, they clearly understand the Father to be none other than Yahweh or Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament. Nothing compels us to believe that he has become some completely different or even radically transformed deity. Jesus brings a new covenant, certainly, but you don't have to read the small print to realize that the God Christians go to church to worship today is still Jehovah. The heretics adopted the same general scenario, but their take on it was radically different. Far from being the object of their worship, Jehovah for them was synonymous with the devil or Satan or Lucifer, just another of the many names by which the evil God who had made the material world was known. They judged him by his deeds, which were well known and had always been arbitrary, vengeful, violent, and cruel. The Old Testament, in describing these deeds, was simply an extended paean to Jehovah's unmitigated wickedness, and was seen by the Cathars and the Bogomils as an irredeemably evil text, evil through and through, that had been written to flatter this evil deity. To adopt it as scripture, as the established Christians had done, was to capitulate entirely to the devil. They therefore exorcised the Old Testament from their lives and would accept no argument based on its authority. They relied instead upon the New Testament, and in some extreme cases on just a few specific books within the New Testament. To this extent, though they were not Christians, theirs was a New Testament religion. However, they also reverenced several other texts, as we shall see later, and were neither known nor accepted by the mainstream church. The creature of mud and the hole in heaven. If the basic dualist perception is of the separation and complete incompatibility of the realms of spirit and matter, then how is it possible that souls, though wholly spiritual, and the creation of the good God, could have ended up imprisoned in human bodies created by the evil God? Cathar and Bogomil missionaries had a varied collection of myths at their disposal to help confront such paradoxes and answer questions arising from them in graphic and engaging ways. The myths weren't dogmas or even doctrines, and it would be foolish to think that they were taken literally. Rather, they were storyboards used as teaching devices. The point being for different teachers to bring different listeners in different circumstances to their own independent understanding of the mystery. In brief, what the dualist myths tell us is that the paradoxical mixing of good and evil in the heart of the human creature came about after the evil God, Jehovah, Satan, had created the material earth as described in the Old Testament. Some of the myths state that he was not satisfied with this achievement, so he attempted to create a man, molding the body out of mud or clay like a potter. But try as he might, he was unable to breathe the spirit of life into the body he had made. For the spirit of life is in the gift of the good God alone. In desperation, therefore, he sent an embassy to the good Father and asked him to send his breath, saying that the man would be shared if he were to be endowed with life. Because God is good, he agreed and breathed into what Jehovah, Satan, had molded the breath of life. Immediately, man became a living soul, splendid in his body and bright with many graces. A quaint sidelight comes from a vernacular form of the myth, repeated to the Inquisition in Toulouse in 1247. A witness reported having been told by a Cathar how the devil made the body of the first man, Adam, and God gave it a soul. But then the man leaped up and said to the devil, "I do not belong to you." So we are to envisage an independent-minded creature here, one who is aware of the good within himself and capable of subduing the evil material inclinations of his body. The natural impulse of this living soul is to return to the realm of the good God, yet it cannot do so without purification because it has now been thoroughly contaminated by matter. Worse, far from sharing Adam as he had promised, it is the intention of the evil God to monopolize the man, drawing him ever deeper into the realm of this world and causing him to forget his spiritual origins. Eve is suddenly, sometimes confusingly, on the scene as also a living soul, and she and Adam are impelled by the devil towards that carnal union that finally consummated their positions as creatures of matter. The original gift of spirit breathed by God into the parents nevertheless is transmitted through the act of reproduction to their descendants, and their souls, now enchained to matter, are reborn again and again on the devil's earth. Another myth tells a different story to make essentially the same points. In this case, the evil God starts out not so much as a completely separate principle, but as an emanation from the good God, a heavenly being of the type that we might think of as an angel. Like Satan in Christian cosmology, his pride, arrogance, and avarice corrupt him, and he must leave the good heaven. In the momentum of his fall, he draws down with him a great crowd of souls who had been created by God and were living close to him in a state of beatitude. It was from this inexhaustible reserve of fallen or captive angels that human souls derived. In other recensions, the God of good and the God of evil may be portrayed as equal and opposite powers, or the latter may again be a fallen emanation of the former. Having created the material world, the God of evil lures a host of angels out of heaven. This he does by promising them possessions, gold, silver, and wives, till they fell like rain upon the earth for 9 days and nights to be shut up in bodies by Satan. Many accounts say that 1/3 of all the angels in heaven, due to their own weaknesses, were thus tempted to descend to earth to animate the zombie bodies that the God of evil had prepared for them. Meanwhile, the God of good notices the radical decline in the angel population and discovers that the departure of so many has ripped a hole in heaven. He prevents further losses by jamming his foot in the hole and tells those who have already fallen that they will remain on earth encased in bodies for the moment and for now. Through the cycle of reincarnation, harnessed to the sex impulse that ensures an endless supply of new bodies to replace those that wear out, the devil believes that he has imprisoned the fallen angels in the human race forever. But the enigmatic words "for the moment and for now" lead us to understand that the good God of good has a plan that will frustrate the devil and restore the lost souls to heaven. Christ's holographic mission to the realm of an alien God. Since the dualist perspective makes the God of good powerful only in the spiritual realm, and the God of evil powerful only in the material realm, it does not easily provide a mechanism for either to operate on the other's home turf. Perhaps this is why it takes a very long time, thousands of years we're told, in all the Cathar and Bogomil cosmologies, for the good God to implement his plan to frustrate the devil. It is a plan conceived out of compassion for the imprisoned souls of the angelic host, because their life on earth, isolated from the Holy Spirit that had filled them before their fall, is one of unimaginable suffering. Denied the radiance of the Spirit and all that is good, they are trapped far from their true home in a dimension to which they do not belong. A Cathar prayer expresses their grief. We are not of this world, and this world is not of us, and we fear lest we meet death in this realm of an alien God. The prayer goes right to the heart of the problem. How is the God of good to project his spiritual power into the material realm of the God of evil in order to rescue the souls trapped there? The dualists all gave the same answer to this question: Jesus Christ. But their Christ was a very different figure from Jesus, the Son of God, born of a man, later crucified and resurrected from the dead, who is worshipped by Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians. The reader will recall that the Cathars and Bogomils believed Christ to have been non-human, an emanation from the good God who could never have been born into evil flesh, but who had manifested in our material dimension as a particularly convincing, yet non-physical apparition. Indeed, it might even be helpful in explaining what the dualists had in mind here to say that their Christ figure was a sort of avatar, not a created material being, but an emission or radiation or instrument of the good sent forth to deal with the created world. Christ's mission was threefold. First, he was to preach a religion and transmit a gnosis that would lift the scales from the eyes of mankind and provide high initiates with insight into the meaning of death, the true character of existence, and the fate of the soul. Secondly, he was to offer instruction as to how humans might best live together through their vast cycles of incarnations in the hell called the earth. In the long-term project of cleansing souls contaminated by matter and preparing them to return to heaven, there was no doubt that certain social arrangements and personal commitments were more conducive to the success of the mission than others. For example, if humanity could be persuaded to organize itself according to the principles of love, nonviolence, kindness, frugality, tolerance, and mercy, then this would obviously be better for all concerned than hate, bloodshed, cruelty, excess, dogmatism, and vengeance. Since the God of evil saw every opportunity to urge us on to all of the latter, and to every other ugly and wicked impulse of which we are capable, the purpose of the teachings of Jesus was to provide a counterbalance. Though in fact he was a phantasm, the perfect life that he would appear to live on earth would also serve as an example to show others the way. The third and by far the most important objective of Christ's holographic mission was to bring down with him from heaven a blazing fragment of the Holy Spirit. For those souls who succeeded in purifying and perfecting themselves on earth, it would provide the final necessary burst of sacred energy that would break the bonds of matter and return them to heaven. We might envision it as a flaming torch lit from the main fire of the Spirit in heaven and now able to transmit its revivifying flame to souls marooned in the material world below. Before his feigned death upon the cross, the Cathars and the Bogomils believed that Jesus had passed custody of the spiritual flame to the apostles through the laying on of hands, the original ritual of the consolamentum, and thence to the primitive church. A short excursion to parallel worlds. For some years, our own long-term research interest has been in religious systems that give special emphasis to the dualisms of heaven-earth, sky-ground, and above-below. We have argued in previous books that such systems were once prominent in the ancient world, most notably amongst the Egyptians. There are, for instance, funerary texts 3,500 years old, and older examples of the same type of material could be cited, that instruct the pharaoh to make a copy on the ground and gain knowledge or gnosis of a region of the sky called the hidden circle of the Duat. He is to do this so that he may become a spirit after death and be, quote, well equipped both in heaven and earth, unfailingly and regularly and eternally. The source of this passage is the 11th division of the Book of What is in the Duat, written on the walls of the tomb of Thutmosis III, 1479 to 1425 BC. A little later in the same text, in the 12th division, the pharaoh is instructed for a second time to make a copy on the ground of the hidden circle of the Duat, so that it may, quote, act as a magical protector for him, both in heaven and upon earth. We have argued that such dualistic sky-ground thinking was a key element in the religion of ancient Egypt for at least 3,000 years, from the beginning of the Old Kingdom to the time of Christ. And we've tried to show how that religion inspired the pharaohs to undertake great construction projects, the pyramids of Giza, for example, or the temples of Karnak and Luxor, which in a variety of different ways sought to copy or reconstitute the perfection of the heavens in the land of Egypt. We were therefore intrigued to discover that surviving texts, traditions, and inquisitional records from Occitania, Italy, and Constantinople contain not only copious illustrations of the well-understood spirit-matter, good-evil dualism practiced by the Cathars and the Bogomils, but also rarer examples of distinctly ancient Egyptian heaven-earth dualism. For example, when Euthymius Zigabanus interrogated the Bogomil evangelist Basil in Constantinople around the year 1100, he was told one of the versions of the fallen angel myths, often used to explain how souls created by the God of good had come to be in bodies created by the God of evil. In this variant, both Satan and Jesus are sons, emanations of the good God. Satan, the elder son, covets the Father's kingdom and rebels against him. The rebellion fails and Satan is expelled from heaven. Yet, through pride and envy, he still yearns to possess a realm where he might be God. He therefore creates the earth and a second heaven, molds his zombie humans from mud and water, and persuades the good God to breathe souls into them. The reader knows the rest of the story. Another hint of the same kind of thinking comes in reports collected by the Inquisition of Cathar teachings concerning the truth of the upper and lower worlds. Here we read about the God of good preaching in the sky to his people, and how he sent Satan down to this world, and how afterwards Satan desired, quote, to have a part of the lower and upper possessions, and the Lord did not wish it, and on this account there was war for a long time. Striking and colorful reference was also made to a Cathar teaching that oxen grazed and plowed the soil and worked on the sky as on the earth. Rather than outlining actual beliefs, it seems to us that such teachings are at best understood as simplified illustrations or mental images to assist neophytes in the analysis of difficult concepts. Embedded in all of them is the fundamental dualist idea of two parallel worlds, one all spirit, one all matter, but here visualized in terms of graphic sky-ground metaphors. It was in the same vein that the Cathars would often speak of the earthly earth and the heavenly earth, the former being our planet, this underworld or hell world on which human incarnations are served out, the latter to be understood as a parallel celestial or heavenly realm. There was a text that was held in the highest regard by the heretics, known as the Vision of Isaiah. It reached the Cathars in the late 12th century from the Bogomils, being translated in the process from Greek or Old Slavonic into Latin. However, it is believed by scholars to have deep roots in the past, probably finding its origins among the Greek Gnostics toward the end of the 1st century AD. In it, we read how Isaiah, a prophet generally exempted by the dualists for reasons that need not detain us here, from their general hatred of the Old Testament, is given a great privilege by the God of good. He sends an angel from heaven to take the prophet by the hand and lead him on a journey through both the earthly and the celestial realms, crossing the barrier between the two, something that, quote, no one who desires to return to the flesh has ever before been permitted to do. As they ascend through the heavens, they see tremendous battles raging on all sides between the emanations of the God of evil and the emanations of the God of good. For just as it is on earth, so also it is in the firmament, because replicas of what are in the firmament are on earth. Rainer Sacconi, a relapsed Cathar perfectus who turned inquisitor in the mid-12th century, reported significant discussions of such ideas amongst his former co-religionists. They believed, he said, that certain of their sacred books had been written in heaven and brought down to earth by Christ, who entrusted them to the primitive church on the completion of his mission. It was to this primitive church, which alone could offer true consolation to the souls dwelling in exile, that the dualists claimed to belong. Through an unbroken chain of consolations, they said their perfecti had preserved and passed down the flame of the Holy Spirit undimmed from the time of Christ. The only problem was that they had been forced to preserve it in secret, because the God of evil, absolute master of this world, had substituted a false church for the true church 1 century before and endowed it with immense material power. This impostor church masqueraded as Christian, but actually served the devil. By working for its downfall, therefore, the Bogomils and Cathars claimed that they only sought to restore the status quo ante that had prevailed at the time of the apostles. Ancient legacy or medieval invention. It sounds like blatant propaganda. Of course, heretics like us to believe that only their church was the authentic descendant of the church of the apostles. Even if they'd only invented themselves yesterday, why settle for anything less? Surprisingly, however, several leading scholars in this field are convinced that such claims are solidly based, and that the Cathar and Bogomil churches somehow did manage to preserve genuine traditions from the earliest days of Christianity. The pro-Catholic scholar Martin Lambert doesn't want to make too much of it when he admits that. By a strange chance, the rite of the consolamentum that appears in the 13th century texts does seem to have been based on a rite for baptism and on practices connected with the catechumenate, those who were candidates for baptism, much earlier than the contemporary Catholic rites of baptism or ordination. But Stephen Runciman points out that this is by no means the only close resemblance. In his view, whether we think them strange or not, there are far too many similarities for us to put them all down to chance. The ritual feast of the Cathars, which involved a simple breaking of bread ceremony, is, if we equate the perfect with the early Christian priest, exactly the same as the early Christian community feast. The Kiss of Peace terminated early Christian services as it did those of the Cathars. The Consolamentum, in its two aspects, was closely akin to the adult baptism administered by the early church to the dying and to the ordination or initiation into its ministry. The very details of the service are similar. In the early church, as was the case with a prospective Cathar perfectus, the catechumen was tested by a long and stern probationary period prior to his initiation ceremony. The actual ordination was identical, consisting of the laying on of hands and of the gospel upon the catechumen's head. While polemical churchmen in the Middle Ages denounced the heretics for maintaining a class of the elect or perfect, they were denouncing an early Christian practice, and the heretic initiation ceremony that they viewed with so much horror was almost word for word the ceremony with which early Christians were admitted to the church. Such similarity cannot be fortuitous. Obviously, the Cathar Church had preserved, only slightly amended to suit its doctrines of the time, the services extant in the Christian church during the first 4 centuries of its life. Runciman notes that everywhere they went, whether it was amongst the oppressed Slav peasants of Bulgaria or amongst free-thinking burghers of Occitania, the heretics were able to exploit pre-existing social and economic conditions in order to gain a foothold. But, he concludes, the political impulse was not everything. Behind it, there was a steady spiritual teaching, a definite religion that developed and declined as most religions do, but that embodied a constant tradition. It is his view that this tradition is in one sense as old as human speculation about the nature of evil in the world, dating back long before Christianity to whatever prehistoric age it was when men first asked why God, if there be a God, could permit it. From there, Runciman is willing to trace the same primordial religion very tentatively into the historical period, seeing elements of it drawn together from Egyptian, Zoroastrian, and even Buddhist ideas. 3 centuries after Christ, it was likewise notable how Stoics and Neoplatonists, each in their own way, condemned the world of matter. And Jewish thinkers of Alexandria began to face the problem of evil, influenced by the emphasis on spirit that they found in the Hermetic lore of Egypt. Runciman concludes that it was the Gnostics of Alexandria and Syria who were responsible, roughly between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, for finally gathering together all such lines of thought and applying them to Christianity. Thereafter, a series of overlapping heresies could be sketchily made out in the historical record. It was these together, Runciman argues, that had preserved the constant tradition from the early Gnostic schools by way of Manichaeism between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD to reach eventually the Bogomils in the 10th century. They, in their turn, transmitted it to Western Europe in the form of Catharism in the 12th century. Hans Soderberg is a second major authority in this field who is unsatisfied that the religious beliefs and practices of the medieval dualists were connected by an uninterrupted traditional chain to the Gnostic religions that had flourished 1,000 years earlier. He believes, moreover, that the Cathars merely gave a Christian clothing to the even more ancient, indeed virtually universal, myth of the combat between the two powers. But other historians are not at all happy about tracing the origins of medieval dualism so far back. Malcolm Lambert thus speaks for many when he tries to place the whole Cathar-Bogomil phenomena firmly in the context of its times, seeing it primarily as a reaction to specific economic, political, and social circumstances. Even he, however, is prepared to admit that Bulgaria, converted to Orthodox Christianity barely a century before the Pope Bogomil began teaching, may have provided uncommonly good ground for the heresy because of the possible influence of pre-existing dualist beliefs in the country. Listening to heretics and heresy hunters. Whatever the personal stance of individual scholars may be on the problem of origins, we've observed a curious phenomenon in reviewing the literature. Very few of the attempts made to trace the history of ideas behind medieval dualism, whether they support or contradict the idea of an ancient tradition, have been willing to pay serious attention to what the dualists themselves or their opponents in the church had to say on the matter. For example, when heresy hunters in Western Europe referred to the Cathars as Manichees, it is automatically assumed that they must have been mistaken because Manichaeism had been suppressed centuries previously. In the East, Theophylact, Patriarch of Constantinople from AD 933 to 956, was one of the first to warn of the stirrings of the heresy that soon became known as Bogomilism, although he did not know of Bogomil by name. Writing to Tsar Peter of Bulgaria, he was just as quick as his counterparts in the West to link the heresy to Manichaeism, and also to the pre-existing dualist religion known as Paulicianism, of which we shall hear more in the next chapter. Quote, "Let the leaders and teachers of this ancient heresy which has newly reappeared be anathema," he pronounced firmly at the end of his letter. Yet scholars are reluctant to pursue the possibility that the heresy thus anathematized could have been anywhere near as ancient as the Theophylact clearly believed. The same academic skepticism also inhibits research into the implications of the heretics' own statements about their origins, all of which have come down to us through the work of the heresy hunters and thus seethe with hostile comments and interpretations. As early as 1143 or 1144, for example, when Catharism was first beginning to be recognized in Western Europe, the monk Everwin of Steinfeld near Cologne in Germany wrote a worried letter to Bernard of Clairvaux appealing for his assistance in the struggle against the heretics, who everywhere in almost all churches boil up from the pit of hell as though already their prince were about to be loosed and the day of the Lord were at hand. Everwin frankly observed that the heresy was gaining ground because of the apparent piety of its missionaries who possessed no lands, no houses, or anything of their own, even as Christ had no property, nor allowed his disciples the right of possession. Equally potent, and apparently extremely convincing, was the heretics' insistence that theirs was Christ's original church, the primitive church itself, reawakened after being forced to lie low in Greece and certain other lands from the time of the martyrs. Though evil powers had made every effort to destroy the church of the good God, we and our fathers of apostolic descent have continued in the grace of Christ and shall so remain until the end of time. Martin Lambert's comment is that one of the reasons the Cathar Perfecti were so convincing was because they honestly thought that they were the only true Christians, that the clergy were the servants of Satan's church, and that Cathar teaching presented a stream of pure underground Christianity, often persecuted, but always surviving and reaching back to the days of the apostles. Whether they were right or not is another matter, but we know what the heretics believed. They believed that their faith was meant to guide the world. This was what was destined. This had been the plan of the good God to fetch the lost souls back to heaven, and he had sent Christ to earth to set it in motion. All had proceeded as it should until the reign of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Then, at the very moment when Christianity triumphed over multiple competitors to become the state religion of the Roman Empire, the devil pulled off his most cunning trick. A clique within the church that insisted on literal interpretation of the scriptures rather than the more allegorical approach favored by Gnostic Christians, seized control and rapidly began to persecute as heretics all those who disagreed with them. Under the interrogation of the Bogomil evangelist, Basil explicitly mentioned the church father John Chrysostom, who is indeed known for his literalist views, as a ringleader of this clique of early heresy hunters. It was such purges between the 4th and 6th centuries AD, said the Cathars and the Bogomils, that had forced their true church underground. Only now, after the sleep of years, was it emerging once more from the shadows. In the 10th century, it had seemed no more than the rantings of a lone vegetarian in Bulgaria. By the 11th century, it had become a cult that had spread throughout the Balkans and to Constantinople. By the mid-12th century, it was firmly established in Italy and Occitania, and could also claim to have won many followers elsewhere scattered throughout the world. Though the scholars have paid scant attention, it seemed to us that what the heretics were claiming was dynamite. Not only that of their forefathers in the Dualist church were the true descendants of the apostles, but also that an ancient conspiracy had denied them their rightful role in shaping the destiny of the West. Perhaps even more explosive was the way they clearly saw themselves as part of a long-delayed counter-conspiracy that had begun in the last 50 years of the first millennium and that had grown steadily, one might also say remorselessly, in the 2 centuries that followed. As we continue to explore the strange phenomena of medieval heresy, we could not shake off the feeling that something ancient and hidden, with a profound purpose for mankind, had briefly shown its face 1,000 years ago, tried to change the world, and failed. Well, that is all of our reading for today, folks. We're going to go ahead and pause this video until our next one. So once again, just want to thank you for joining us. If you are interested in the subject, please look forward to our upcoming videos. We are taking this as an excerpt from the book by Graham Hancock, The Master Game. And in the early section of the book is a wonderful exposition of the history and teachings of the Cathars. We also run a Facebook page called The Cathars. Feel free to go join that page so that we can further our discussions and explore more deeply into the teachings and ideas behind Catharism. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. God bless you.